Mike Collins, the astronaut. You may have more in common with him than you think. I'm talking about Mike Collins on this episode of the Driving with Rob podcast. I know what you're thinking. Mike who? Mike Collins. Mike Collins was one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, but you never hear about him. And I got to thinking about Mike Collins the other day, and I got to thinking how the whole Apollo 11 mission depended on Mike Collins doing his job. The success of that mission really depended on Mike Collins, and you never hear his name. Apollo 11, as you know, in 1969, landed on the moon. NASA sent 3 astronauts to the moon on the Apollo 11 mission. It was Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins. Well, I'm sure everybody knows Neil Armstrong's claim to fame is he became the first man to walk on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. You know, that was his line. He practiced before he ever got into the capsule, before he ever got into the rocket to go to the moon. He already came up with this line, what's going to be the first thing he's going to say, because it was already planned out. He was going to be the first man to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, too, the same day. Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. He drove the lunar module, or he flew the lunar module, I guess. And what I'm really thinking is this module was so small that probably Neil Armstrong had to be the first because he was on the passenger side. But at any rate, Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, both of these men walked on the moon and became the first 2 men, the first 2 human beings to ever walk on the lunar surface. But there was a 3rd astronaut on that mission, a guy named Mike Collins. Mike Collins was part of the Gemini program. Mike Collins became one of the first people to ever do a spacewalk, to actually put on a spacesuit and exit an orbiting spacecraft during the Gemini project, or the Gemini launches, before the Apollo launches. So he was still in the NASA astronaut program and was picked to be on the mission with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11. Mike Collins was just as capable of becoming the first man on the moon. He was just as capable of walking on the moon as anybody. And he was there. But you see, so much depended on Mike Collins doing his job correctly to make Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's job possible. You see, Mike Collins flew the command module. If you remember anything about the Apollo missions, you have the lunar module that actually went to the moon, that actually touched down on the moon. But you have the command module. The command module orbited the moon while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were walking on the moon. The command module was the ship that was going to take them back to Earth, that was going to take them back home. And Mike Collins orbited the moon in the command module 30 times. 30 times he went around the moon. And if you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, and you know what a big deal it was when the command module went to the dark side of the moon. The moon was literally between Earth and the command module. So they lost radio communication with that command module every time it went around the dark side of the moon. Mike Collins did it 30 times. But see, Mike Collins was critical to this mission because he had to fly the command module, because that lunar module on the surface of the moon only had enough fuel to get Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong back to the command module. If something went wrong and Mike Collins couldn't fix it, all 3 of those guys would have died in outer space, because the command module had the rocket and the fuel to take them back home. And seeing another thing that I thought about, did Mike Collins get lonely ever? You think about the most alone you have ever felt in your life. The most lonely, the most isolated, the most cut off from everybody else you've ever been. Mike Collins was on the dark side of the moon 30 times. He couldn't talk to Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin while he was orbiting. He couldn't talk to Mission Control. He couldn't talk to Cape Canaveral or Houston or whoever it was he was talking to. He was completely out of radio communication 30 times during the Apollo 11 mission. Now that is being alone. And you think, well, the moon is relatively close compared to how far away Mars is, or how far away Venus is, or how far away the sun is. By comparison, the moon is very, very close. The moon is 238,000 miles from Earth. So when you think about the most isolated, the most alone you have ever been in your life, Mike Collins was 238,000 miles. 238,000 miles from home. And couldn't talk to anybody. Oh, now when he came back around and the moon was behind him, then he could talk to the other astronauts. He could talk to Mission Control. He could talk to Houston. But that had to be a long, quiet trip when you're on the dark side of the moon. This was the most alone I think a person can be, has ever been, and live to tell about it. I mean, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had each other. But there's poor old Mike Collins just doing his job. And so I got to thinking about how many of us never get celebrated, never get your name in the paper. You won't go down in history as doing anything great. But maybe just the fact that you did your job correctly made it possible for something great to happen. Made it possible for greatness to happen. Made it possible for a great event to happen. And nobody ever heard about it. Nobody ever knew about it. But it was something that literally could not have happened without you. But nobody will ever know. And that's the reason I say it's kind of an abstract thought that Mike Collins was a hero, but he really was. The Apollo 11 mission could not have happened without Mike Collins. And Mike Collins was completely 100%, 238,000 miles alone. But he did his job, he did it flawlessly, and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong became the first two guys to ever walk on the moon. So yeah, to me, Mike Collins is a hero. But so are a lot of people who never became famous, who just did their job so that other people could do theirs. Let them have the fame and glory. And just smile to yourself knowing they could not have done it without you. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate you downloading and listening. If you're not a subscriber, if you're not a follower, please, on your podcast player, whatever it is you use to listen to podcasts on, there should be a button that says subscribe. Some of the podcast players say follow. But if you'll go ahead and click on that, it doesn't cost you anything, but that will sign you up so that when I release a new episode, you'll get a notification knowing that there's a new episode available and you should go listen. And if you don't mind, just share the podcast on Facebook, on Twitter, wherever it is you share stuff. And just let your friends know that if they would like to listen to the Driving with Rob podcast, all you have to do is Google the Driving with Rob podcast. I'm on iTunes, I'm on Spotify, I'm on Google Podcast. Pretty much anywhere you go to listen to podcasts, you can find me. Tell your friends to Google the Driving with Rob podcast, and they'll find it. All right, thanks again. I really do appreciate you a lot, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye now.